The projector was still warm when the new VP smiled like the verdict had already been signed. One sentence cut through my first board presentation. I didn't argue. I didn't blink. I just reached for my phone and said, "Check your email." Boardrooms always pretend to be about ideas. That's the first lie. They're about temperature, about gravity, about who is allowed to breathe normally and who has to earn every inhale. And that morning, the room was running cold in the polished, expensive way only executive floors can manage. Glass walls, brushed steel, a table so long it made ordinary people sound less certain than they were. I was standing at the far end of it, remote in one hand, the opening slide of my presentation glowing behind me in clean blue light. Q3 risk exposure, vendor leakage, governance vulnerabilities. The kind of deck that makes people sit straighter when they realize the numbers on the screen are not theoretical, and the woman explaining them is not there to entertain them. It was my first board meeting, not first at the company, not first at handling pressure, not first at walking into a room where half the people had already decided what they thought of me before I spoke. But it was my first board meeting, and everyone in that room knew it. You can always tell. They become very interested in their coffee cups, their tablets, their little private rituals of power. And at the center of that ritual, in a charcoal jacket sharp enough to qualify as a weapon, sat the new VP. She had arrived 3 weeks earlier with the kind of introduction that travels faster than an internal memo. Strategic, decisive, brought in to redefine pace. In corporate dialect, that usually means one thing: make fear look like efficiency. She hadn't said much when I walked in. Just one quick glance, measured, filed away. I'd seen that look before. It's the look people wear when they mistake calm for softness. The board chair gave a small nod. "You may begin." So I did. I kept my voice even, clear, unhurried. I walked them through the first 2 slides: exposure patterns, approval bottlenecks, a sequence of internal overrides that had happened too neatly to be accidental. Not dramatic language, not inflated language. Facts arranged with enough discipline to become dangerous. The room shifted, not visibly, not all at once, but I felt it. One director stopped typing. Another leaned back and folded his arms. Someone near the windows lifted his head for the first time since I'd started speaking. Numbers do that when they stop being decoration and start pointing at names. I clicked to the next slide. A timeline appeared. Clean, precise. No wasted color, no wasted words. That was when the new VP cut across me. "In your first board meeting," she said, leaning back as if she were correcting a clerical error, "you might want to learn not to waste everyone's time." The sentence landed with surgical neatness. No raised voice, no theatrics. That made it worse. A public dismissal delivered in a private tone, the kind designed to make the target feel foolish for even recognizing the insult. A few eyes dropped instantly. Classic survival reflex. Nobody wants to be caught making eye contact at the moment humiliation enters the room. I lowered the remote. The projector hummed softly behind me. She gave a thin smile and added, "Actually, let me save us all some time. You're done here." Silence. It spread fast, across the lacquered table, across the legal pads, across the soft hiss of conditioned air. Even the city outside the glass seemed to pull back for a second, as if the skyline itself wanted a better angle on the damage. The board chair frowned, but not enough to intervene. That told me everything. This wasn't impulsive, or at least not entirely. This had weight behind it. Momentum. Somebody had decided before I entered the room that I would not be allowed to finish that deck. A hotter person would have argued. A prouder person would have snapped. A less experienced person would have rushed to defend herself, which is exactly what rooms like that count on. Once you become emotional, they stop hearing content and start documenting tone. I didn't do any of that. I looked at the screen for one quiet beat, as if considering whether the slide itself deserved a better audience. Then I set the remote on the table. Not dropped, set. Small sounds matter in moments like that. Precision unsettles people more than panic ever will. The new VP folded her hands. She thought the scene was over. I could see it in her posture, that tiny exhale of someone already enjoying the internal headline. First board meeting, public correction, problem removed, neat, efficient, memorable. I reached into my blazer pocket, took out my phone, and unlocked it without hurry. One of the directors glanced at the board chair. Another shifted in his seat. Somewhere to my left, someone cleared his throat and instantly regretted it. The new VP's smile sharpened. Is there a reason you're still standing there? There are moments when a room doesn't need volume. It needs placement. I lifted my eyes to hers and said, very calmly, check your email. That was all. Not a speech, not a challenge. Just a sentence placed exactly where it needed to land. For the first time since she interrupted me, something in her expression moved. Not much. Barely a flicker. But enough. Enough for the board chair to notice. Enough for the general counsel's assistant, seated 2 places down, to look instinctively toward her laptop. Enough for the room's confidence to lose its perfect posture. The VP gave a short laugh meant to suggest boredom. This is not the time for games. It isn't, I said. And that was the problem. Because games require uncertainty. This wasn't uncertainty. This was sequence. I could feel the air changing now, molecule by molecule. The way a summer sky changes before a storm, when nothing visible has happened yet, but every living thing somehow knows the atmosphere has chosen a direction. The board chair turned slightly. What email? I didn't answer right away. Not because I was being dramatic, because timing is a form of architecture, and if you place the next beam too early, the whole structure collapses before it has weight. Instead, I looked at the stack of printed materials near the center of the table. Board packets, agenda copies, notice attachments, the paperwork nobody reads until it becomes the only thing in the building that matters. Then I said, the one sent 4 minutes before this meeting began. That was when the assistant to counsel opened her inbox. I saw it happen from the corner of my eye, that tiny shift from passive attendance to active search. The stillness around the table changed texture. It was no longer comfortable silence. It was investigative silence, the dangerous kind. The new VP sat a little straighter. Just a little. Enough. And suddenly, the room that had looked so certain a moment ago began to resemble what it really was. Not a stage, not a throne room, not a place for effortless declarations, but a machine. And machines are wonderful things right up until one forgotten clause catches in the gears. I glanced once at the screen behind me, my unfinished slide still glowing in patient blue, waiting like it already knew I'd be back. Then the counsel's assistant inhaled sharply, not loudly, just enough for everyone to hear it. And that was the first sound in the room that truly mattered. The sound was small. That was the unsettling part. Not a gasp, not a scandalized whisper. Just the soft intake of breath from counsel's assistant, the kind a person makes when a line on a screen suddenly acquires teeth. Every head turned. The new VP didn't move at first. She kept her shoulders squared, chin lifted, fingers still resting over one another with that polished, executive composure people mistake for control. But control is a delicate fabric. Pull one legal thread from the underside, and the entire garment starts to come apart in your hands. The board chair looked toward counsel's assistant. What is it? She didn't answer immediately. Her eyes were moving across the message too fast now, then back again, like someone double-checking whether the building had truly shifted beneath her feet. The general counsel, who had spent most of the meeting wearing the expression of a man professionally unimpressed by oxygen, extended a hand. Forward that to me." No one spoke while he read. The silence changed shape. A few minutes earlier, it had been the silence of power being performed. Clean, public, humiliating. Now it was something else entirely. Something denser, less elegant. The silence of people realizing that a decision had been made in a room that may not have had the right to make it. I remained standing. Not rigid, not triumphant, just still. Stillness is underrated. It lets other people do all the revealing. The new VP gave a brief, dismissive laugh. I assume we're not delaying a board session over some procedural footnote. The counsel finally looked up, and for the first time that morning, his attention landed on her the way a blade lands on glass, quietly but with consequences. "It's not a footnote," he said. There was no rise in his voice. That made everyone listen harder. He adjusted his glasses and looked at the board chair. "The meeting notice was amended under Section 11 at 8:56 a.m. The revised filing added a mandatory review item and extended presentation authority to the reporting officer attached to the notice." A pause. Then, even more precisely, "her." No one breathed for a second. My unfinished slide glowed behind me like a witness. The board chair straightened in his seat. "Extended by whom?" "By the Office of Governance Compliance," Counsel said. "Copied to legal. Timestamp is valid. Distribution list is intact. The amended notice appears to have been properly delivered before session commencement." The room didn't explode. Rooms like that never explode. They crack. Hairline fractures first. A director removing his glasses to buy time. Another reaching for the printed packet as if paper might somehow reverse email. Someone near the far end of the table scrolling too fast through digital attachments, as though speed itself could manufacture a different answer. The new VP finally turned toward counsel. That amendment was not cleared through me. He met her gaze without any interest in the drama. Section 11 does not require clearance through you. The sentence dropped into the room like a steel pin. Not loud, definitive. I could almost hear the architecture of the morning changing around us. A few moments earlier, I had been the interruption. Now I was the reference point. Not because I had raised my voice, not because I had demanded anything, but because the paper trail had done what paper trails do best when handled properly. They outlived performance. The VP's jaw tightened, just slightly, but enough. She turned to the board chair. "This is absurd. We are not going to suspend governance over an opportunistic email sent minutes before the meeting." "Amended notice," Counsel corrected. He didn't say it sharply. He didn't need to. Accuracy is the coldest form of embarrassment. The board chair looked between us, then toward the printed packet in front of him. He flipped one page, then another, then found the attachment index and stopped. I watched his expression do that subtle executive thing. When a person is trying not to reveal that the room has stopped following the script they had mentally approved. "Why wasn't this flagged at the start?" he asked. Counsel's assistant answered in a careful voice. "The updated distribution appears to have arrived after packet print, but before session call." The VP leaned in. "Exactly, which means it should have been held for the next meeting." Again, Counsel looked at her. Again, with unbearable calm. "That is not what Section 11 says." A director near the window finally spoke. "What does it say, precisely?" Counsel glanced back to the message. That when a duly transmitted amendment introduces a governance risk item requiring same session review, the presenter named in the notice retains standing to complete the submission before adjournment or dismissal of the item. This time there was no small inhale. This time there was the faintest rustle of alarm. Because now it was visible to everyone. She had not interrupted a routine slide deck. She had attempted to cut off a protected presentation attached to a valid board notice amendment. In simpler language, the kind nobody in that room would dare use out loud, she had tried to slam the door while legal was still holding the frame. The VP sat back, but not elegantly anymore. The confidence was still there in outline, but the details had begun to fail, like expensive makeup under unforgiving light. "This is being overstated," she said. "At worst, it's a sequencing issue." I let the words pass. Then, because timing had finally ripened, I said, "Only if the sequence didn't matter." Every eye came back to me. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't sharpen it. I just let the sentence sit there, clear and level, because the truth in rooms like that doesn't need decoration. It needs oxygen. The board chair looked at me for a long moment. Not warmly, not apologetically, but differently. As if he were seeing, perhaps for the first time that morning, not a presenter who needed to be managed, but a variable that had been improperly assessed. "What is the governance risk item?" he asked. There it was. The hinge. The room seemed to narrow, all its polished surfaces suddenly serving a new purpose, to reflect tension from every angle. I stepped toward the screen and picked up the remote from the table exactly where I had left it. The small click of plastic against wood sounded impossibly loud. "Unauthorized override clustering," I said. "Cross-functional approvals routed through a non-designated channel over a 6-week period." One director frowned. Another stopped scrolling. The VP spoke before anyone else could. "That allegation has not been substantiated." I clicked to the next slide. Rows of timestamps appeared. Approval paths, internal routing anomalies, names redacted where protocol required it, but the pattern unmistakable, clean enough to survive scrutiny, ugly enough to disturb a room full of people who preferred risk to remain theoretical until after lunch. "It has now," I said. Nobody interrupted. Nobody even shifted. And for one delicious, razor-thin moment, the only sound in the room was the projector and the quiet, involuntary collapse of certainty. The board chair turned to Counsel. "Can we proceed?" Counsel closed the email, folded his hands, and said, "You don't proceed." A beat. Then he delivered the sentence that changed the temperature of the entire floor. "You reconvene." The word moved through the room like a current. Not loud, not dramatic. Worse. Official. The assistant was already taking notes. One director reached for his phone. Another asked for the amended notice to be circulated again. The machinery had shifted. Once a board begins correcting itself in real time, prestige becomes strangely fragile. Everyone starts protecting minutes, language, signatures. No one wants their name attached to the wrong version of events. The new VP looked at me then, really looked, not as an inconvenience, not as a first-timer, not as a woman she could erase with a sentence spoken over polished wood, as a problem. And that, oddly enough, was the first honest thing she'd done all morning. I faced the screen, thumb resting lightly on the remote, while behind me the board chair instructed the room to pause and reconvene under the amended notice. It should have felt like victory. It didn't. Not yet. Because I knew something they didn't. Section 11 had only reopened the door. It had not revealed who had tried to lock it from the inside. If you've ever watched power walk into a room and mistake itself for permission, this story is for you. Subscribe, like, and stay with me. Because what happened after the board reconvened wasn't just a correction. It was the kind of silence people remember long after the meeting notes are buried. When a meeting is reconvened, the furniture does not move. That's the deceptive part. The same leather chairs remain in place. The same water glasses catch the same pale light. The skyline still stares through the glass as if it has never seen a human being lie in a controlled tone. Everything looks identical. But the room is no longer the same room. A few minutes earlier, I had been standing at the screen like a formality someone intended to erase. Now the board had been forced to acknowledge, in the driest legal language available, that I had standing, the notice had standing, and the item on my slide had standing. Which meant one very inconvenient thing. The truth had a seat at the table again. The board chair adjusted his papers and cleared his throat.
This session is reconvened under the amended notice. Proceed. It was a simple sentence, administrative, almost dull. But in executive spaces, dull sentences are often the ones that do the most damage. Fireworks make headlines. Procedure rewrites outcomes. I nodded once, turned back to the screen, and let the next slide settle into focus. No dramatic animation, no theatrical reveal.
Just a grid of timestamps, routing paths, and approval sequences arranged with the kind of precision that makes nervous people dislike spreadsheets on a spiritual level. Over the past 6 weeks, I said, a series of approvals were redirected through a channel not listed in the governance authorization map. No one interrupted. That alone was almost luxurious. I clicked again. A visual chain appeared. Department requests on the left, escalation path in the center, final authorization points on the right. Clean lines, brutal logic, the kind of diagram that doesn't accuse anyone out loud and somehow still manages to make the entire room feel personally addressed. One of the directors leaned forward. Another removed his glasses, then put them back on, which is boardroom language, for this is suddenly much worse than I hoped. I kept going. The issue is not one isolated exception, I said. It's repetition, same detour, same velocity, same endpoint, different departments, which means we are not looking at accidental inefficiency. We are looking at pattern behavior. The phrase landed exactly where I wanted it to. Pattern behavior. It sounds clinical, harmless almost, but people who live in institutions understand the danger immediately. A mistake can be forgiven. A pattern has intent. The new VP sat perfectly still. If posture were a religion, she would have been a cathedral. But stillness reveals different things in different people. My stillness read as composure. Hers now read as calculation. I could practically see her deciding, second by second, which version of this morning might still be salvageable. She folded one hand over the other and said, "You're inferring motive from workflow irregularities." There it was. Not denial, never denial, not yet. Just a neat attempt to reframe the fire as weather. I turned slightly toward her. "No," I said. "I'm separating motive from pattern." The pattern is already enough. That drew a silence more attentive than the earlier ones. This one had edges. Counsel said nothing, but I saw his pen move. Always a lovely sign. I clicked to the next slide. A list of internal requests appeared, each tied to a date, a timestamp, and an approval reroute. Names remained redacted, as required. Titles remained masked where policy demanded restraint. But the structure of the thing was impossible to miss now. It was too clean, too repeated, too confident in the way only bad behavior becomes when it assumes nobody patient is watching. The reroutes all bypassed one control layer, I said, tracing the sequence with the laser pointer. And every bypass accelerated discretionary authority over cost, access, or vendor selection. The board chair's expression tightened. How much discretionary authority? Enough to alter exposure, I said. Not enough to hide forever. A faint sound came from the far end of the table. Someone exhaling through their nose with the restrained misery of a person realizing their morning has become billable in the worst possible way. The VP gave a cool smile. It arrived a little late, which made it less convincing. You're presenting a process critique as if it were misconduct. It was almost elegant. Almost. I rested the clicker against my palm and let the pause stretch half a beat longer than comfort allows, just enough to make the room lean inward without moving. "Not yet," I said. 3 little words. They altered the oxygen. Someone near the windows looked up sharply. The assistant stopped typing for a fraction of a second. Even the board chair's face changed. Not outwardly, not theatrically, but in that expensive, restrained way powerful people react when a sentence introduces legal weather they had not packed for. The VP's voice became softer, dangerous, soft. "Then be very careful with your phrasing." I met her gaze. I have been. That was the funny thing. People often mistake restraint for weakness right until restraint starts building a case. I advanced to the next slide. This one was uglier, not visually. Visually, it was spare, almost boring. A timeline, a series of approvals, a flagged compliance checkpoint, a delayed disclosure note. But underneath the neat formatting sat the kind of sequence that makes organizations suddenly rediscover their love of accountability. This reroute, I said, indicating the highlighted path, occurred 31 minutes after a flagged review request. The board chair looked up. Flagged by whom? Compliance operations. And who moved it? I'm not naming individuals in this session unless counsel instructs otherwise. That bought me credibility and bought the room tension, which was a trade I was happy to make. Counsel finally spoke. Continue with structure, not identity. Of course, I said. The VP's mouth flattened by half a degree. There's a particular kind of frustration that appears when someone realizes the rules can no longer be bent theatrically. They must now be bent carefully, which is much harder to do under fluorescent honesty. I moved to the next point. The relevant concern, I said, is that the rerouting did not merely accelerate decisions. It changed who saw the decisions before they became active. That line hit harder than the charts, because everyone in the room understood what it meant. Visibility is power in companies like that. Not title, not charisma. Visibility. Who gets looped in, who gets copied? Who gets informed just late enough to become harmless? Most corporate bloodshed happens in the quiet space between those verbs. One director, older, silver-haired, usually unreadable, finally spoke. Are you telling this board there was selective notice? There it was, the phrase nobody wanted, said too early. I did not answer immediately. Not because I was uncertain, because some sentences deserve to arrive with proper footsteps. I'm telling the board, I said carefully, that selective timing appears in the same ecosystem as the reroutes. The board chair stared at the screen. Appears? Yes. Not confirmed? Not on this slide. Another silence. This one tasted different. Less shock. More anticipation. The room had moved past resistance now. It had entered the dangerous phase, curiosity. Once directors become curious, allegiances start losing decorative value. People stop defending personalities and start protecting themselves from minutes, signatures, and future subpoenas. The new VP shifted for the first time since the reconvening. Only slightly. A hand to the edge of her folder. A glance toward counsel. Tiny movements. But tension is a language, and by then everyone in the room could hear it. She said, "This is becoming speculative." "No," said the silver-haired director quietly, without looking at her. "It's becoming expensive." That sentence did more than any raised voice could have done. A few heads lowered. Someone made a note. Counsel's assistant began typing faster again, the keys soft but relentless, like rain starting on glass. I let the moment breathe, then clicked once more. A final slide appeared. Simple header, minimal text, one highlighted line from the amended notice, and beneath it a narrow summary of risk exposure tied directly to board oversight obligations. No fireworks, just consequence. The reason Section 11 mattered this morning, I said, is not only that it protected my right to finish, it preserved the board's right to know this before any further approvals were normalized. That one stayed in the room. You could feel it settle on suits, on polished wood, on carefully neutral expressions. Nobody likes discovering that what looked like interruption might actually have been prevention. The board chair pressed his thumb against the edge of his notes. How many more slides? 3. He nodded once. Take us through them. Behind my ribs, my pulse was steady as a metronome. Not because I was fearless, because by then the room had passed a threshold I knew well. Once people stop asking whether you should be speaking and start asking how much more you have, The axis has shifted. Quietly, completely. I looked at the screen, then at the faces around the table. Some guarded, some pale, some suddenly interested in governance as if they had invented it personally. And then I saw it. Not on the slide, not in the packet, on the table. A printed version of the original board agenda, half covered by a legal pad, just visible enough to show a notation in dark ink beside my item. A small handwritten mark. 2 initials. Casual at first glance, invisible to anyone not already trained to notice what doesn't belong. But I knew those initials. And for the first time that morning, the cold in the room reached somewhere deeper than professional instinct, because the person who had tried to stop the presentation might not have been acting alone. For a strange, suspended second, the room lost sound. Not literally. The ventilation was still whispering through the ceiling. Someone at the far end of the table was still turning a page with the cautious delicacy of a person hoping paper might make them invisible. Counsel's assistant was still typing, those soft, precise keystrokes, tapping out a version of the morning none of them would later enjoy rereading. But for me, the room lost sound, because I knew those initials. They sat in the margin of the printed agenda, with the casual arrogance of something that had never expected scrutiny. 2 letters in dark ink. Nothing dramatic, no grand flourish, no cinematic underline. Just a private mark beside my item, as if the outcome had already been assigned a tone before I ever entered the room. I kept my face still. That mattered. There is a particular danger in recognition. Not the recognition itself, the reaction to it. The smallest flicker in the eyes, the fraction of a pause too long, the microscopic tightening of the mouth. Rooms like that are built on surveillance dressed as etiquette. Someone is always watching, especially when no one appears to be. So I did what experience had taught me to do long before that morning. I moved only on the inside. My thumb rested lightly on the clicker. My shoulders stayed level. My voice, when I spoke, was clean and almost conversational. The next concern is sequence integrity, I said. No one knew yet that while the room watched the screen, I had begun watching something much smaller and much more dangerous. The board chair gave a short nod. Go ahead. I clicked to the next slide. A decision matrix appeared. Approval chains, timestamp clusters, dependency flow. It looked harmless enough to an outsider. Dry, technical. The kind of thing people pretend to understand in meetings until a single highlighted box forces them to understand very quickly. The issue is not simply that notices were delayed or rerouted, I said. It's that timing and routing appear to have worked together. Counsel looked up slightly. Good. I continued. In an ordinary breakdown, you see noise. Randomness, sloppy inconsistency. Here, we see selective friction in one direction and selective acceleration in another. That combination tends to produce outcomes before it produces explanations. A director near the center of the table frowned. Meaning, I said, some items encountered process drag, while others moved with unusual clarity. The silver-haired director leaned back. And the distinction between those groups? I let half a breath pass. Not operational importance, I said, exposure. That landed hard. You could always tell when a room of seasoned executives heard a word they didn't want attached to internal behavior. Their posture didn't collapse. It sharpened. Hands stopped moving. Pens hovered. Expressions became emptier, which in rooms like that usually meant thoughts had become much louder. The new VP folded her arms, an elegant gesture on the wrong day. And you've determined that already? She asked. From workflow maps? There was a faint smile in her voice, the kind meant to suggest I had become ambitious with my conclusions. I turned toward her, not fully, just enough. No, I said, from repetition. That quieted the room again. Repetition is a brutal thing. It strips behavior of innocence without ever needing to raise its voice. 1 event can be explained. 2 can be contextualized. 5 begin to look like architecture. I clicked again. This slide showed review windows, not names, not accusations, just intervals, submission, delay, reroute, activation. The kind of clean chronology that makes bad intent deeply uncomfortable because chronology has no temper and no vanity. It just stays put. These windows, I said, are too consistent to dismiss as administrative congestion. The board chair stared at the screen. How consistent? I moved the laser pointer to a boxed sequence on the right. Within minutes, I said, and always around the same control gap. The general counsel finally spoke. You're saying the control gap became predictable. I'm saying, I replied, someone behaved as if it were. That was a careful sentence, deliberately careful, enough to push the room forward without giving anyone the luxury of calling me reckless. The VP's gaze hardened. That is still interpretation. I looked at the slide, then at her, then back to the room. Of course it is, I said. All governance analysis begins as interpretation. The question is whether the pattern survives review. A small silence followed. Then Counsel, with all the warmth of a locked file cabinet, said, "So far it does." That sentence changed the room more than mine had, because when I spoke, they could still tell themselves I was invested. When legal spoke, the room had to admit the floor was tilting. One of the directors reached for the agenda packet again. Another opened a second screen on his tablet. Someone near the windows quietly asked for the notice amendment to be recirculated one more time. It was fascinating, really, how quickly highly confident people rediscover process when process begins pointing back at them. I let them have that moment, not out of kindness, out of strategy. The agenda on the table was still there, half covered. Those initials still visible if you knew where to look and exactly how not to look. Too obviously. I did not glance at it again. Glancing again would have meant the first glance mattered. So instead, I let memory do the work. 2 initials. Familiar for a reason I did not yet enjoy. The board chair broke the silence. If timing and routing were aligned, what was the practical effect? I clicked to the next slide. A compact summary appeared. Delayed visibility, compressed review, accelerated approval exposure. No drama, just consequence in neat rows. The practical effect, I said, was that review authority had less time to react, while discretionary authority had more room to move. The silver-haired director's expression cooled further. Convenient? I didn't smile. Yes, I said, for someone. That sentence hung in the air longer than the others, because now the room was beyond whether this was awkward, beyond whether the new VP had been merely aggressive, beyond whether my interrupted presentation had been a bad look or a regrettable misstep. Now they were entering the territory boards hate most, intent without a name. It is much easier to manage scandal when it comes wearing a badge, a person, a title, a neat summary for counsel and communications. But intent without a visible owner? That spreads. It invites memory. It makes people review emails they had ignored. It turns ordinary assistants into dangerous witnesses and marginal notes into weather systems. The VP uncrossed her arms and placed both hands on the table. A reset gesture. Too late. You still have not established misconduct, she said. Her tone was controlled, but no longer effortless. The edges had changed. The words were being selected more carefully now, which meant she no longer trusted instinct to protect her. I answered just as carefully. I haven't used that word. No, she said. You've simply built a stage around it. There was the irony. Thin, sharp, almost elegant. For the first time that morning, I nearly admired her. Nearly. The board chair looked between us. Let's keep this on recordable ground. That was one of those corporate phrases designed to sound neutral, while quietly admitting the room had wandered close to a cliff. Of course, I said. And then I clicked to the last slide in the section. At first glance, it was the simplest one yet. A line from the governance framework, a highlighted sentence on review obligations, a notation on notification integrity. Beneath it, a single summary line where notice is selectively constrained, oversight becomes performative. No one spoke. No one moved. The board chair read it once, then again. Counsel set down his pen. That, more than anything, made the air tighten, because men like him did not set down pens unless they had moved from listening to deciding. The VP's eyes went briefly, not to me, not to counsel, not to the board chair, to the printed agenda. Just for a second, just enough. And that was all I needed. Not proof, not yet, but recognition. Recognition is a dangerous currency. It spends quickly. I kept my hands steady and asked, would the board like me to continue into the notice chain? That question split the room open in silence. Because they understood what notice chain meant. It meant origin, distribution, sequence. It meant the hidden plumbing behind the polished wall. It meant we were about to leave the safe, abstract floor of governance language and walk directly into the mechanics of who knew what, when, and perhaps who had tried to make sure certain people knew it too late. The board chair did not answer immediately. He looked at Counsel. Counsel looked at the agenda. Then, very slowly, he said, yes. One word, measured, final. Heavy in the way only simple words become when they open the wrong door. And somewhere behind my ribs, beneath the discipline, beneath the even breathing, beneath the polished stillness I had worn all morning like armor, a colder realization settled into place. Because if the notice chain said what I thought it said, then those initials in the margin were not a coincidence. They were a warning. The most dangerous things in corporations are rarely said out loud. They are forwarded, delayed, omitted, reworded, sent to 5 people instead of 7, marked urgent for the wrong eyes and routine for the right ones. Whole careers are rearranged not by explosions, but by distribution lists. So when Counsel said yes and gave me the room to walk into the notice chain, the air changed again. Not dramatically. Worse. It became careful. I turned to the final section of the deck and clicked once. The screen shifted from risk architecture to notice flow. A simple sequence appeared. Draft, legal review, compliance flag, amended notice, board circulation, timestamps, delivery windows, confirmation marks, nothing theatrical. It looked almost disappointingly plain, like the blueprint of a building no one notices until the walls start leaning. This, I said, is the notice chain attached to the amended Section 11 filing. The board chair watched the screen without blinking. Counsel's assistant had stopped pretending to type casually. Her fingers now moved with the brisk precision of someone who understood the minutes were no longer recording a meeting. They were recording a future argument. I let the slide settle. Then I pointed to the first timestamp. The draft amendment originated in governance compliance at 8:41. Next point. Legal review acknowledged at 8:47. Next, compliance escalation confirmed at 8:52. And then the final entry. Board circulation completed at 8:56. No one interrupted. The new VP sat perfectly still, but by then her stillness no longer read as control. It read as containment, like a polished lid pressed firmly over boiling water. I clicked again. A narrower table appeared on the right side of the slide. Routing metadata, internal forwarding path. 2 distribution breaks highlighted in pale amber. The silver-haired director leaned forward first. What are those? Interruptions, I said. Counsel looked up. Clarify. The amendment was validly circulated, I said, but before final distribution, 2 internal routing actions altered visibility windows. The board chair frowned. Altered how?
I held the clicker loosely, like it belonged to a calmer morning. One delayed acknowledgement to a standard board packet channel by 90 seconds, I said. The other redirected a courtesy copy through an executive review path that had no authority over the filing. The room went still in a more honest way this time. Not confused, not skeptical. Still the way hallways go still outside operating rooms. The new VP's voice came cool and flat. Courtesy routing is not interference. No, I said, not by itself. I clicked again. A side-by-side comparison appeared. Standard amended notice flow on the left, actual flow on the right. Same beginning, same legal validity, different midstream behavior, a tiny bend in the river. Just enough to change what reached whom and when. The filing survived, I said. That is not the issue. Counsel folded his hands. Then what is? I looked at the room. Then I gave them the sentence they had all been circling for the last 20 minutes.
The issue is that someone behaved as though timing around the amendment needed management. No one wrote for a moment. That was the gravity of it. Even the assistant paused. The board chair's voice was quieter now. Can timing management affect a valid notice? Yes, counsel answered before I did. Not necessarily its legal existence, but potentially its practical visibility. There it was, not dramatic, not cinematic, just devastatingly dry. Practical visibility. The phrase landed on the polished table like a cold instrument. I clicked to the final slide. At the top was the agenda image pulled from the printed packet version. Enlarged, cleaned, cropped to the margin beside my item. And there, unmistakable now, were the initials. Small, dark, familiar. No one spoke. I could hear the projector fan. I could hear someone's watch against the edge of the table. I could hear the city beyond the glass, pretending it was not listening. The board chair looked from the slide to the packet in front of him, then back again. What are we looking at? A notation on the pre-session print packet, I said, placed beside the protected item before reconvening. The VP's jaw tightened. That proves nothing. No, I said evenly. Not alone. I let the pause hold. Then I added, but the initials matched the executive review path that received the courtesy reroute. This time the silence did not arrive politely. It dropped, heavy, immediate, absolute. One director took off his glasses and did not put them back on. Another looked straight at counsel, no longer bothering to hide the fact that this had crossed from awkward governance discussion into something much more expensive. The board chair's voice turned formal in the way voices do when people realize the next sentence may someday be read back to them. Counsel. He did not need to ask a full question. Counsel already knew which one mattered. He looked at the slide. Then at the amended notice. Then at the routing metadata on his laptop. When he finally spoke, his tone had no heat in it at all. The meeting was improperly interrupted, he said. The Section 11 presenter had standing. The amended notice had effect, and the courtesy reroute created an appearance of managed visibility around a protected governance item. Appearance? Such a civilized word for the moment. A polished room realizes it may have just watched an internal ambush fail in real time. The VP turned toward him. An appearance is not misconduct. No, counsel said, a beat. But it is enough to trigger preservation. That word hit harder than any accusation could have. Preservation, not blame, not verdict. Worse, process, real process. The kind that freezes inboxes, pulls records, locks narratives before people have time to improve them. The board chair sat back slowly. Not relaxed, nothing remotely like relaxed, but settled into the unpleasant dignity of someone who now understood the meeting he thought he was controlling had, in fact, been controlling him. He looked at me, then at the unfinished deck, then at the new VP. And finally he said, with the sort of administrative calm that ruins entire weeks, "This matter will be referred for immediate internal review. The minutes will reflect that the presentation was interrupted before completion, despite valid notice standing. No one objected. That was the revealing part. No indignant speeches, no heroic denials, no grand defense of executive judgment. Just silence, the real kind now. The kind that arrives when power hears the lock click from the outside. I set the clicker down beside the packet and closed the distance between myself and the table by a single step, not to claim victory, just to finish what I'd come to do. The final recommendation, I said, is suspension of any dependent approvals until notice integrity and routing conduct are reviewed. The silver-haired director nodded once. Agreed. Then another voice. Agreed. Then another. Softly. One by one, like doors closing down a corridor. The VP did not speak again. She sat there in that immaculate charcoal jacket, perfectly arranged, perfectly composed, and for the first time all morning she looked exactly what she had tried so hard not to be. Not powerful, not decisive, not inevitable. Just early. The board chair gathered his papers. Counsel marked the packet. The assistant resumed typing, and the room began the strange ritual executives perform when they know history has become paperwork. I reached for my laptop. The slide behind me was still open, the one she had tried to cut off before I could finish. Blue light, quiet numbers, patient truth. And as I closed the deck, Counsel looked once more at the amended notice, then at the room, and said the only sentence that mattered in the end. The record will show the meeting was reconvened. Silence, and this time it belonged to me.